Two brief points. Coming back basically to the how it's raised. In view of the fact that the government has been relatively ineffective here in actually ensuring that the banks, those banks largely in public ownership, increase their lending, how on earth can we be sure that it will not be passed on to customers, and particularly obviously the banks in which the government has no stake? And the second point is, if such a substantial amount is going to be raised, and it is a very large figure, how can we be sure it will be used effectively? I think particularly in development aid, in view of the ongoing debate in which you're involved, Professor Sachs, in which obviously people like Dambisa Moyo take a very different stance from you on the effectiveness of development aid. We don't want the money going directly from the pockets of bankers into the pockets of African dictators and their cronies.
That's my favorite topic.
Jeff, you're allowed 3 minutes on Dambisa
Yes.
Moyo, no more, right?
She's a banker. But I just want to say a word about how the money can be deployed. The fact of the matter is that modern approaches to development assistance, and we're in a very exciting era of advance, have shown time and again that when the money is actually there, the advances are dramatic. Whether it started with the drop the debt and getting children in school, extraordinarily powerful, or the campaign to get the global fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria going, or now to get 200 million bed nets out there, and we're seeing malaria burdens come down dramatically. I'd like to point you to an article in the International Herald today on the Millennium Villages Project, which is, the reporter went out there and saw tremendous breakthroughs in food production, disease control, children in school, and so forth, business development, because that's how modern development properly done is showing itself time and again. So the answer is nobody should be thinking about aid in the old way of giving it to that SOB because that's our SOB, which was the Cold War kind of aid. We're talking about targeted investments in disease control, targeted investments in increased food production, targeted investments in ensuring that children are in school, targeted investments assuring that they're getting proper nutrition when they're there. And there's a whole host of dramatic success stories that come from the fact you mobilize technology, resources, and a business approach, basically, milestones on the ground. You know what you're doing, you count it, you measure it, you monitor it, you audit it. That's what makes the aid package work right now. And what's happening is dramatic when you look at it. And I would cite the most dramatic thing right now is the malaria burden coming way down because the technologies are being pushed, reaching the people who need it, and we're already saving hundreds of thousands of lives a year. But it's going to be far more dramatic in the next couple of years because of this practicality of the delivery approach.
Claire, I think you had something to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think I just wanted to also echo what Jeffrey was just saying about aid. I mean, I think it's easy to forget in the sort of discussion about the sort of theory of aid and the big numbers that, you know, we're talking about people's lives. You know, I mean, just to take 10 years ago, I was living in a village in the north of Mozambique. While I was there, there was a measles epidemic. You know, a child died every single day for weeks. Can you imagine that village and the funerals and the coffins? And that doesn't happen anymore because of a vaccination program. You know, there are amazing things happening, and we shouldn't forget that these are people's lives, people just like us. But I think also on this question about whether it's passed on and, you know, whether we're all going to end up paying this in the end, obviously because this is such a hot topic, there's lots of questions being raised about this before and after the launch of the campaign. So we've done a lot of research on this from lots of different angles. There's two basic ways of looking at it. First of all, to look at what already happens in markets when the costs of doing business change. Essentially, a tax is just going to raise the cost of doing business on certain transactions. When you look at what has happened historically when that has happened, in the kind of big money, that what's called the wholesale markets, so the kind of where these big investment banks moving large amounts of money around. When costs have changed in those markets, they have tended not to get passed on to the sort of banks that you or I do business with every day. That's just, you know, when you look historically, because those wholesale markets are very competitive, if banks started trying to pass them down to other, you know, to other parts of the market, they simply lose business. So that's one way of sort of trying to estimate whether the cost would be passed on. Another way is to look at what the markets actually look like, who is in these markets. The main companies that are doing business in these sort of big financial markets, which is where the taxes would fall, are investment banks and hedge funds. And those banks are very far removed from the kind of transactions that you or I do every day. And if you look at who are the main people involved in those banks, who are the main shareholders in those banks, who is it who mainly has their money in those banks, it tends to be a small number of very wealthy institutions and very wealthy people. And it's not our pension funds, by and large. It's not the kinds of money that you or I deal with every day. So we have put a lot of effort into trying to answer this question. There are a lot of references on the campaign website for those of you who want to look into the detail. But we're absolutely confident that compared with any other tax, which is of any political feasibility, this is a much, much fairer way of doing it, because a far higher proportion of the tax, almost all of it, falls on those people and those institutions who are best able to pay. It's much fairer than VAT rises, for example, which is the other kind of possible sort of tax rising, money raising possibility, which is being discussed in political circles, which has the opposite effect. If you raise VAT, it's poor people who pay.
I won't comment about the first part. I think enough has been said about that. The second part I would relate not only to international development but to charities based in the UK. The SOP regulations are absolutely vital, looking at the objects of the charity, looking at the charity's strategic objectives, are they actually in line with the objects of the charity, and then looking at the impact assessment and the accountability, the smart objectives that the charities need to have. We certainly need to continue to work to get smarter so that we make the public's money go that bit further as well. So it's not only international but at home as well.
If I could, I just want to say what Claire said is really important. Measles deaths are down by more than 90% now in sub-Saharan Africa compared to the beginning of the decade. This is a spectacular success. It is a direct result of, quote, aid, which is lambasted by some people who try to lump everything together of anything that they want to sweep into this. What we're talking about is something practical and something targeted and something life-saving and something proven. And that's, I think, the important point.